You're listening to
DNA ID.
Brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime,
Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
On Sunday, October 4th, 1959, a woman was picking wildflowers in the woods off of Davis Road, north of Bonnewell Road and south of Pioneer Road, in the city of Mequon, Ozaukee County, Wisconsin. Bending down to peer at something, she discovered an object that most certainly was not an aster or goldenrod. It was a small human skull, with hair still attached and several teeth missing. Balled-up newspaper was sticking out of the base of the skull. The woman summoned the Mequon police, who collected the skull and commenced a search of the area, but nothing else was found in the immediate area, and rain soon hampered the efforts, so the search was called for wet and darkness. But the next day, officers found more bones. 684 feet from where the skull had lain on the roadside, in a watery ditch at the eastern exit of a culvert, Sergeant Charles Engel of the Mequon PD located a leg, an arm, and a rib cage. The searching officers had to bail water from the ditch so it wouldn't impede their visibility. They soon found 9 small teeth. They also found a breastbone, a hip bone, and vertebrae where the bulk of the skeleton had been found. All the bones were small, clearly belonging to a child. Only the skull was found by itself, and it lay on the western side of the culvert, while the rest of the remains, presumed to be from the same body, were found on the east side of the culvert. Continuing their search efforts, police meticulously sifted through the mud and soil where child Doe's bones had been found. The hopes were of finding a button, a piece of jewelry, clothing, anything at all that could aid in their inquiry. And their efforts paid off with the finding of 3 matching buttons, white, the kind that are typically found on a button-down shirt. But not a scrap of clothing was located, and police seemed to have jumped to the conclusion that the child was a girl, due to moderate circumstantial evidence of that. The child had several inches long strawberry blonde hair. Ozaukee County Coroner Dr. James Walsh conducted an examination of the remains and concluded that the child was white, 4 to 9 years old, and was 3'2" to 3'9" tall. The remains had been exposed to the weather for between 2 and 6 months, he said. The cause of death couldn't be determined, but it was noted that there was no evidence of bludgeoning on the skull, so a head injury was ruled out. A piece of newspaper was found in the base of the skull, a segment large enough that crime scene technicians were hoping to be able to determine the publication and date. X-rays at the Wisconsin State Crime Lab in Madison revealed that the child had several broken bones, including a rib that had knit back together, indicative of old, healed injuries. But she also had several broken bones that had not healed, like a broken jaw, that were indicative that the child had likely died from blunt force trauma at the hands of a violent killer. The crime lab disagreed with the pathologist, saying that the child's sex could not be determined from the bones. But Mequon police were pretty sure they knew who the child was. 6-year-old blonde-haired Nancy Marie Ritchie had gone missing, along with her 41-year-old mother Myrtle, from their Milwaukee home on May 13, 1959. They were reported missing by Nancy's father, Gordon Ritchie, after Myrtle left a note saying she was taking Nancy on a vacation. Nancy's description was consistent with this little girl found in the ditch. Gordon told police his wife had been in a mental institution and had taken the child and vanished shortly after her release. But then, upon receiving the report of the crime lab that child Doe had several large cavities, the investigators concluded that she could not be Nancy, whose dental records showed no such decay. To my horror, it appears that Gordon Ritchie was asked to view the severed skull. He was unable to identify the desiccated head as his daughter, but he wasn't certain it wasn't her either. Police contacted Nancy's dentist, but he said Nancy had not been seen in his office in over 18 months, plenty of time for a sugar-loving child to develop cavities. It was decided that Nancy's dentist would personally examine child Doe's teeth to see if they could be one and the same. And Mequon Police Chief Robert Milk made a public plea for any doctors who might have x-rays of Nancy Ritchie relating to the old fractures to please contact him. Gordon Ritchie also brought with him a lock of his daughter Nancy's hair, which was sent to the crime lab to be compared to the hair of child Doe. Police conducted a very thorough search of the area surrounding the locations where the skull and the rest of the skeleton were found. Of interest to police was a partially burned corrugated cardboard box containing ashes. This was found about 300 feet away from the skeleton. Another burned box was found about a half-mile away, along with a burlap bag and a pair of rubber gloves with the top half of the right hand cut off. These were found under the edge of a woodpile. The woodpile belonged to a home where, about 20 feet from the road on the east side of the culvert, was found a piece of stained butcher paper for meat with, quote, a few bits of a substance that had the appearance of tough gristle on it, as it was described to me. These findings were not specifically disclosed to the public, but much was made of them in the newspapers because Mequon Police Chief Milk said they had found what appeared to be pieces of skin, along with the rubber gloves, the burlap sack, a pair of work pants, and a copy of the Milwaukee Sentinel dated May 20th, 1959. This all seems to have been somewhat alarmist jumping to conclusions. There is no indication that any pieces of skin were actually found, and there is no indication that any of the items found were related in any way to the case of the dead child. There was quite a bit of that, alarmism in this case. Mequon is a peaceful suburb. I myself lived there for a time. Dead children stuffed into culverts are not the norm. I would bet there has never been such a case in the town's history. It was originally reported that the child had been decapitated and the skull deliberately stuffed with newspaper and so on. Newspapers all over the state carried the story about the, quote, maniac butcher, calling the scene grisly and macabre. But most of this turned out to be exaggerated. No pieces of skin were found. The working theory of the police was that the girl had been killed elsewhere and then hidden in the culvert. Eventually, the body had disarticulated as it lay in the dark, muddy water, and it had washed out of the culvert's end. The head had detached through these natural processes and then likely was moved to where it was found by animal activity. The newspaper inside the skull, well, it was likely a nesting rodent. Police started canvassing the area where the body was found, trying to locate witnesses who might have seen anything at all. One farmer did have something to report, something so unbelievable that it seemed right out of a horror movie. The previous May, about 5 months earlier, he had seen what was referred to as a suspicious vehicle in the area near the ditch. It's not surprising that the farmer noticed this. Outside of the slightly more built-up areas, the majority of Mequon is farmland and is notoriously flat. An observant farmer would likely notice a strange car pulled over on the side of a roadway among the fields. The unnamed farmer reported to police that he saw a vehicle parked alongside the culvert, where the body was later found, and a small hand was hanging from the car. He was so perturbed by this vision that he reported the incident to the Mequon police, but by the time the police went to check on the vehicle, it was gone. I don't know exactly what the culvert looked like, but with the body stuffed inside it, the police would never have known to look there. As far as they were concerned, they were looking for a vehicle called in by a concerned citizen, and that was it. The farmer was able to furnish a partial license plate, and police started to look into the registration. Milwaukee police assisted in the investigation. As I mentioned, the Mequon force was unaccustomed to this kind of case. Missing child reports in the area, extending as far as Chicago, about a 90-minute drive from Mequon, were checked to see if child Doe could be any of them. There was quite a turn of events when the superintendent of the Wisconsin State Crime Lab in Madison, Charles Wilson, released information on October 7th that the newspaper that was found stuffed into the skull was a sporting magazine. Marks he had found on the skull told him that the newspaper had been stuffed inside the skull by a rodent using the paper as nesting material. This was deemed a blow to the investigation, as it was hoped that the newspaper would provide clues as to the origins of the deceased little girl. As Chief Milk said on October 8th, quote, "We have 2 strikes against us. We don't know who she is or who killed her," end quote. Mequon police assembled flyers with the known information about child Doe and disseminated them to law enforcement agencies nationwide, issuing alerts about missing female children. Area doctors were also consulted about the x-rays of child Doe showing that she had broken bones that would have required medical attention. Police investigated a lead called in by a grandmother named Neela Hout from Cincinnati who said that her granddaughter Phyllis Jean Finney, age 8, had been missing after seemingly being kidnapped from her father following a parental separation. No one had seen Phyllis since September 1st, 1958. However, Neela had received mail from Phyllis with Canadian postmarks. By the 3rd week in November, police were still nowhere. News reports about the little girl no one cares about are heart-wrenching. Chief Milk reportedly theorized that the girl might have been mentally or physically handicapped and thus did not attend a mainstream school where her absence would be noted. Or, he told the Sheboygan Press, her parents may have killed her deliberately or accidentally and discarded her in a panic while passing through the area. In January 1960, Mequon police believed they were onto something when they learned of a Waukesha woman who had gone missing with her 2 children in October 1958. One of them was a 6-year-old girl. Her husband, the children's father, said he and his wife had divorced in 1959 and his wife had left, leaving no forwarding address. I don't know how they resolved that this missing child was not child Doe, but it wasn't. According to the sheriff's office, 250 people were questioned and over 200 leads were pursued as deputies attempted to learn the identity of the deceased child. Child Doe became known in the media as the child nobody wanted, which would prove to be very apt. The child's body remained unclaimed and unnamed in Madison for decades, assigned laboratory identification number 6426. In 1966, though, there was a massive break in the case. Child Doe had been unidentified for 7 years when a tip in a neighboring state brought new leads. On March 27th, Illinois police arrested William Jutila and his wife Hilja Jutila. They were 43 and 42 years old respectively and lived in Chicago. Here's why they arrested the couple, both of Finnish heritage. William and Hilja were from Michigan. Hilja had immigrated to Michigan from Finland as a girl, and there met and married William, a first-generation American born in 1922 to Finnish immigrants. They tied the knot on May 29, 1950. Soon, a child, a boy named Markku, rounded out the small family. But suddenly, sometime in late 1958 or in 1959, the Jutila family disappeared. 6 to 7 years later, at Christmastime 1965, William's brothers back in Hurontown in the UP of Michigan finally got a letter from him. He said he and Hilja had settled in Chicago and invited his family to visit. In a couple of visits to the Jutilas' Chicago home in January 1966, everyone asked about Markku. In response to questions about the whereabouts of their son, the couple hemmed and hawed and gave conflicting stories, putting off the questioners. William and Hilja's responses about why Markku was not around weren't satisfactory to the family. In one response, they said Markku was at a home for, quote, retarded children. On another occasion, they said he was just playing outside. Eventually, William's brother Uno filed a police report in Houghton County, Michigan, out of concern for the missing child. Starting in late 1965, based on the complaints of Uno Jutila, police in Houghton County, Michigan and Chicago, Illinois jointly investigated the whereabouts of Markku and realized he had not been accounted for years. Friends and family of the Jutilas in Michigan verified that while living in that state, the couple had a son named Markku. But one day, the entire family just vanished. They abandoned their home, leaving washing on the line and food on the stove. None of their friends or family knew where they'd gone. Since then, the couple had lived in Chicago, where Hilja worked as a cleaning lady to support her husband, who had been injured in an industrial accident in a Michigan copper mine. So in March, Houghton County Deputy Sheriff A. Franz Heiderman went to Chicago. Accompanied by Chicago Detective Sergeant William Gorman, they inquired of the couple on their Fairfield Avenue block. Nope, no one had ever seen a child in their company. They then knocked on the door and interviewed the Jutilas, described by the Chicago Tribune as quiet and placid, about the whereabouts of their son. According to the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, quote, the couple could not explain where Markku was, but denied any harm had come to him. Jutila and his wife talked to each other in Finnish. They were unaware that Heiderman could understand Finnish, end quote. This is awesome. The couple was taken to the police station and separated for individual questioning about their inconsistent stories about where their son was. In his session, William broke down and confessed, and later signed a statement documenting that Hilja had beaten the 6-year-old boy because he was making funny faces at them. After the beating by Hilja, Markku died in his arms at their Coburn town home in December 1958. The couple immediately left the state, fleeing to Illinois. In her session, Hilja was told that her husband had reported what she did and had made his peace with God. She cried and said, "We put him in a culvert." Illinois authorities contacted police in Milwaukee and Green Bay, uncertain about what areas the couple might have passed through on their flight to Chicago. They learned that authorities in Mequon did indeed have a child who had been left in a culvert there, although it was in 1959, not 1958, and they thought child Doe was a girl. But the description of Markku lined up with what they knew about the age, race, and hair color of child Doe. On March 28, 1966, Michigan and Illinois authorities issued an arrest warrant for the couple, charging them with first-degree murder of their child. The Michigan Tech Archives houses a large state document archival collection, including the original psychiatric evaluations of both William and Hilja and their court files. They also are a repository for microfilmed copies of the Daily Mining Gazette, which covered the case extensively. The following information is derived from a lengthy, recent Michigan Tech blog post by Emily Schweibert covering the Markku Jutila case. The Jutilas appeared before Houghton County Justice of the Peace Louis Gerbeck on October 1, 1966. The charges were, quote, that William Russell Jutila and Hilja Maria Jutila feloniously, willfully, and of his and her malice aforethought, did kill and murder one Markku Edward Michael Jutila, end quote. The couple pleaded not guilty and were denied bond. Each was provided a separate public defender. This is a passage from the Michigan Tech Archives blog post, quote, Ivan Locoro, a physician on staff at Houghton's Rice Memorial Clinic for Mental Health, visited William in jail on May 11th and Hilja a week later to conduct psychiatric evaluations. Dr. Locoro concluded that the Jutilas displayed normal intelligence and confidence. They showed no signs of legal insanity or mental illness. Hilja, he said, spoke cheerfully about her adoptive son until describing his death when she cried. William insisted that he and his wife had loved Markku very much. Both remained firm in their assertions that they had not murdered their son, but that he had died suddenly from an illness he picked up at kindergarten. They had not wanted to be blamed for failing to call a physician, said Hilja, and they had not had the money for a doctor or an undertaker, claimed William. They had panicked. They had instantly decided to go to Chicago. They fled with their child's body and then abandoned him under the culvert. They were guilty of no more than that. So as you heard, once the couple was arrested, they'd changed their tune. Their story now was that Markku died from an illness. The couple claimed Markku had been ill for several days before he was found dead in his room. In fear, they decided abruptly to relocate to Chicago, depositing Markku in the culvert along the way. I don't think anyone bought it, given the evidence of damage done to Markku's little body, including the broken jaw. In circuit court in Chicago before Judge Daniel Ryan, the couple, who did not speak fluent English, reportedly denied having anything to do with their son's death, but agreed to waive extradition so they could be sent back to Michigan to face Houghton County charges. According to the Grand Rapids Press, Hilja said to the judge, quote, I am innocent and I want to prove my innocence. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel reported that Hilja sobbed throughout the proceedings. The couple was held in Cook County Jail while they awaited the arrival of Deputy Heiderman, who was dispatched from Houghton County to pick them up and return them to Michigan. A preliminary hearing was held over a 3-day period in early November, according to the Michigan Tech Archives blog, citing reporting by the Daily Mining Gazette. Prosecutor Walter T. Dartland called 3 Chicago police officers to testify, as well as William Laughlin, a University of Wisconsin anthropologist who had worked on the Mequon case. Quote, Dr. Laughlin described the body he had investigated and testified that it was consistent with a 6-year-old boy like Markku Jutila, end quote. On the stand, Dr. Laughlin told the court that the child's bones exhibited signs of abuse, pointing to healing and new fractures. a former Mequon police officer showed photos of the body discovery in 1959. And friends and neighbors of the Jutilas were called to testify to the family's sudden flight from the UP and the vanishing of their son, Markku. Quote, on the third day, Sheriff John Wittinen brought to the court the long tape recording of an interrogation the couple had undergone soon after being extradited to the Copper Country. At the defense's request, Justice Gerbeck cleared the courtroom gallery of spectators before playing the audio tape in its entirety. When it concluded, he adjourned the hearing, stating that he needed time to review its transcript and consider what charges were appropriate to bring against the Jutilas, end quote. On November 10, 1966, Justice of the Peace Gerbeck granted defense motions to dismiss first-degree murder charges against William and Hilja. This doesn't happen very often, but the judge listened to the evidence presented by the prosecution at the preliminary hearing and sided with the defense, who countered, quote, that the prosecution had failed to connect the defendants with the remains of a child found in Mequon in October of 1959, end quote, that from the Associated Press. From the Michigan Tech Archives blog, the prosecution, quote, needed to demonstrate that Markku Jutila was dead before anything else. The child's body under the Mequon culvert seemed too similar to Markku's and too aligned with the stories the elder Jutilas had offered to be coincidental. Yet, the best of medical science in 1966 could not establish definitively that the decomposed remains were, in fact, his. In the absence of evidence that Markku was certainly deceased and what he deemed a persuasive connection to the Jutilas specifically, Gerbeck finally concluded that the prosecution's case was inadequate, end quote. The Justice of the Peace's ruling was based on the legal principle of corpus delicti, the Latin phrase that means body of the crime, dictating that a person cannot be convicted of a crime absent proof that a crime occurred. The judge denied the state's request to downgrade the charges to manslaughter and ordered the Jutilas freed. It's unclear whether the prosecution had failed to present sufficient evidence that murder had occurred. Remember, the cause of death had not been determined, or whether there was no evidence that the remains found in Wisconsin were those of Markku Jutila or both. Of course, nowadays, DNA would be used to connect Markku to his parents. Back in the 1960s, there was no way to prove who the child was. Without a body, there was no murder, according to outdated legal principles dating back centuries. The first no-body conviction in the U.S. was in 1957, when Leonard Scott was convicted of killing his wife, Evelyn Throsby Scott, whose dentures and glasses were found in his incinerator. Even though the Jutilas had confessed, they retracted those confessions, and there was no evidence that the remains in Mequon were their child. But wait, he wasn't their child. What I mean by that is, even if this case took place in modern times, Markku could not have been connected to William and Hilja via DNA. He was adopted. Who was Markku Jutila?
Every day, predators are targeting children and teens online. The Department of Homeland Security's Know to Protect campaign provides resources to combat online child exploitation and abuse. Learn how you can help protect our kids online and join the fight. Visit knowtoprotect.gov so together we can stop online child exploitation. That's KNOW, 2protect.gov.
After the Jutilas walked, nothing was done on the case of child Doe. He was essentially shelved until October 2023, when the University of Wisconsin's anthropology department started inventorying the human remains they had in their possession. A skull in the possession of Dr. Jordan Karsten, associate professor and department chair of the Department of Anthropology, Global Religions and Cultures, with the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, was labeled with Wisconsin State Crime Lab number 6426. Dr. Karsten approached Crime Lab analyst Hannah Moose-Clausen, who realized that a nearly complete child's skeleton was in the possession of the Wisconsin State Crime Lab labeled Unidentified Human Remains Case 6426. The skull and skeleton were from the same case, that of an unidentified child. So they had a nearly complete child skeleton, but were uncertain as to who he or she was. Crime Lab records showed that number 6426 had been found on October 4th, 1959 in Mequon, Ozaukee County, Wisconsin. The medical examiner's office had a record of Ozaukee County case number 59-127, in which a child's remains were discovered on October 4th, 1959 in the city of Mequon. It was the same case, which had come to an abrupt end when the trial of Markku Jutila's parents had failed to happen. Now, in 2023, the Wisconsin officials wanted to figure out who the child in the culvert really was. Wisconsin Department of Justice Division of Criminal Investigation Special Agent Neil McGrath and Ozaukee Sheriff's Office Detective Scott Heller began working with the Ozaukee County Medical Examiner's Office to try to identify the child's remains. The decision was made to extract DNA from the skull. It was sent to Bode Technology, who was able to obtain DNA sufficient for an STR profile from the skull. The DNA belonged to a male, not a little girl, as was originally suspected in Wisconsin. The STR profile was entered into CODIS, but there were no matches in the missing persons and unidentified human remains database. Details of the case were entered into NamUs as UP126034, but nothing came of this either. It was time to try forensic genealogy. The Petrus Pyramid area of child Doe's skull was sent to Othram Labs in Texas, who performed the SNP extraction and was able to obtain a workable profile. This profile was transferred to investigators with the Wisconsin Department of Justice Division of Criminal Investigations Identity Resolution Team, so that a genealogical search could be performed using family tree DNA. The top match found there was 344 centimorgans, and the second highest match was 127 centimorgans. It was a promising case. Special Agent Neil McGrath and another analyst started building out the family trees of these top matches, and they started to see the same surname pop up. More from the OCSO press release. Quote, in September 2024, investigative genealogy revealed that the DNA extracted from the skull had several matches to family members of the Breiney family, particularly Josephine Breiney, end quote. Josephine had a documented child who had been given up for adoption. Again from the press release, quote, all investigative genealogy results supported that the skeletal remains belonged to Chester Alfred Breiney, end quote. I thought I would include this tidbit from Facebook, made by a commenter on the Ozaukee County Sheriff's Office post about the case being solved. The commenter's name is Laura E. She wrote, my family was the ancestral DNA contacted about this case, his birth family. We had no idea he even existed until I was contacted. Amazing work by Special Agent Neil McGrath. Thank you to all involved for closing this case and helping him rest in peace. In response to her comment, someone asked, did you know anything about his birth mother who lived in our area? Laura responded, we didn't. My mom's family is from Gay, but she, my mom, was much, much younger than the birth mother, her first cousin, and doesn't remember her dad talking about this niece. My mom's brothers, who were more the same age as the birth mom, have passed away, so we don't know any family history. So the top match ended up being a first cousin once removed to Josephine's child, Chester Alfred Breiney. Okay, so they had a name, but let's back up a bit. While the genealogy analysis was going on, Special Agent McGrath and Detective Heller from the Ozaukee County Sheriff's Office conducted research into Markku's adoption. They had every reason to believe the child in the culvert was Markku, and they knew from the old court case that Markku had been adopted. Michigan State Police assisted Special Agent McGrath with locating adoption records for Markku Jutila. It was learned that he had been adopted from the Houghton County Goodwill Farm, an orphanage which had since changed its name. All records prior to the year 2000 were located off-site in a central Michigan records repository. With help from the Michigan State Police, Special Agent McGrath had to obtain a court order to review the adoption records maintained by Michigan Department of Health and Human Services and the Houghton County Probate Court. It was a literal miracle that these records were still accessible since they dated back to the mid-1950s, and most of the agencies had nothing, including the Chicago Police and the Houghton County, Michigan Sheriff's Office. From an Ozaukee Sheriff's Office release, quote, these records revealed that the birth name for Markku Jutila was Chester Alfred Breiney, with a birth date of February 26, 1952. Chester's birth mother was listed as Josephine Breiney of Houghton, Michigan. The father was listed as unknown. Adoption records showed that Chester was admitted to Houghton County Goodwill Farm, which was an orphanage, and was adopted by Russell and Hilja Jutila on March 24, 1955. End quote. Special Agent McGrath also received court records from the Houghton County Court regarding the criminal complaint charging both William and Hilja Jutila with the murder of Markku. This research all came together right as the genealogy results were gelling. The reports tended to confirm each other. Adoption records showed Markku was born Chester Breiney, and the genealogy traced the child's DNA to mother Josephine Breiney. There were no records of Josephine having any other children, and she died, leaving no known living relatives, on October 23, 2001, in Kearney, Michigan. A little background here on Chester's biological family. Josephine Alverna Breiney was born August 4, 1931 to Jacob Breiney and Anna Louise Haller in Houghton, Michigan. Her son Chester Arthur was born February 26, 1952 in Houghton, Michigan, when Josephine was 20. Josephine's family had splintered after the death of her father and the mental illness institutionalization and subsequent death of her mother in 1948. At 16, Josephine was parentless. She gave birth to Chester at age 20. No one, not even the genealogists, knows who Chester's father was. No father is listed in the adoption records from 1955, and the probate court, for some reason, had oversight over Chester and Josephine. According to the Michigan Tech Archives article, quote, 9 months after her son's birth, the probate court of Houghton County declared Josephine unable to care for him to its satisfaction. Like most local children whose parents had received this decision, he was sent to Houghton's Goodwill Farm, end quote. The Goodwill Farm was a 50-year-old institution founded to provide foster and adoption services for children left orphaned by mine accidents. By the 1950s, the farm was located adjacent to the Michigan Tech campus, which explains the archival interest in the institution. Chester was sent to the farm on November 15, 1952, before he was a year old. Note that we have no indication that Josephine wanted to give her son up. It seems the decision was taken away from her. And that was when William Russell Jutila and Hilja Jutila entered the picture. Back to the Michigan Tech Archives blog, quote, William was a local boy, one of at least 10 children of Michael and Alida Jutila of Torch Lake Township, and a graduate of Lake Linden High School. In his 20s, he came upon a picture of a young divorcee in Finland in his aunt's home and felt a spark of attraction. William's aunt arranged for the two to correspond, and a romance blossomed. Hilja sailed to the United States in May 1950. Within days of her landing in America, she and William exchanged vows in Chesil. 18 months after the wedding, the 30-something couple remained childless, and they applied to the Goodwill Farm as prospective adoptive parents. In November 1952, the home notified William and Hilja that it had received custody of a little boy named Chester by order of the probate court. Would the Jutilas be interested in fostering him? Yes, they said they would. Chester was placed in their Franklin Township home that same day. Chester's formal adoption followed on March 24, 1955. By this time, he had been given a new name in keeping with his adoptive parents' heritage, Markku Edward Michael Jutila. William and Hilja spoke Finnish as their first language and taught Markku to speak it too. By the time he started school, he apparently understood very little English, end quote. Okay, all that from the Michigan Tech Archives blog. But I'd like to point out that some people who knew Chester at school said nothing about his struggles with the English language. Here is a comment posted on the Ozaukee County Sheriff's Office Facebook page after the announcement about Chester. The poster is a woman named Marge D., who hails from Hancock, Michigan. She wrote, I knew him as Markku. He lived across the street from our family. My 2 older sisters and I were playmates of Markku. He and I were in kindergarten together. We knew something bad happened as they left our area so unexpectedly. This is amazing he has been identified. Thank you to the many folks who worked this case. I cannot imagine the hours put into it. We never forgot Markku, even though we were very young. We knew there was abuse. It was not addressed then. It is wonderful he will be put to rest finally. May Markku rest in peace. Ozaukee Sheriff Christy Knowles held a press conference announcing the identification of the remains found in Mequon more than half a century earlier. She said that the child had been identified as Chester Allen Breiney, who, quote, died as a direct result of his torture and abuse by his adoptive parents, end quote. One thing I didn't mention earlier was that when Dr. Carson examined the bones that matched up with the child's skeleton now known to belong to Chester Breiney, quote, It was determined the individual most likely suffered from significant neglect based on their dental health and new bone formation that was a result of infection, trauma to the periosteum, or bleeding. The individual may have suffered from rickets and had a healed fracture on one of the left ribs, end quote. The press release elaborated, quote, child abuse is real. So many children are affected by the trauma they receive at the hands of people who are supposed to love and nurture them. That is what happened to Chester, and because his abuse went undetected, Chester died as a direct result of his torture and abuse by his adoptive parents. Chester may now rest in peace as the truth of his death is known. No child should leave this earth like Chester did, end quote. The press release went on to say, quote, the Ozaukee County District Attorney's Office reviewed the results and the positive DNA identification of the remains. Both individuals implicated in the death of the child, his adoptive parents William and Hilja Jutila, died in 1988. Therefore, there will be no future prosecution in this case, end quote. Yes, William and Hilja both died in 1988, never having served more than a few months in jail for what they did to their child. Hilja died in Hancock on January 30th, and William passed away just months later on April 23rd. Investigators were unable to locate any photographs of Chester Alfred Breiney / Markku Jutila. There is one fuzzy photo of him that appeared in the papers around the time of the trial, but Chester is no more than 2 years old in the photo. DCI Special Agent Truly Nielsen, who is also a forensic artist, painstakingly created a facial reconstruction drawing from the skull remains, 3D printed, to show what Chester looked like in the 2D reconstruction. I'll post that image on social media. In a really lovely tribute, once Chester was identified, the Mequon community went all out to give him a proper funeral. Community members contributed to a little white casket, flowers, a grave marker, and cemetery plot. The funeral and gravesite service at St. Mary's Cemetery in Port Washington was attended by dozens of people. A children's choir performed some appropriate hymns. It was apparently very moving. Special Agent Neil McGrath told me that although he generally is able to compartmentalize work and personal stuff and remains somewhat detached at work, the choir of children, probably not much older than Chester, really struck a chord with him and other law enforcement officers in the church. Reverend Patrick Wendt told the congregation, "We want to thank you for surrounding him with that love and care that he didn't seem to have much of in his life." Once again, get out your tissues. Even though Chester has been identified, we are left with some unanswered questions. One is the timing of when Chester was killed and left in the Mequon culvert. Everyone agrees, and the story told by the Jutilas is consistent, that Chester was killed and then dumped fairly expeditiously. The Jutilas did not just sit around with the child's dead body. The Jutilas and their family all maintained that they fled Michigan in December of 1958. Investigators believe that that is indeed when Chester was killed. So how do we account for the farmer seeing a strange car with a child's hand hanging out in May 1959? We can't, other than to chalk it up to a mistake. I do think it's unlikely that the Jutilas drove around with their child's dead limbs dangling from the windows of the trunk. Another thing we don't know is how the Jutilas selected the location where they left Chester. Their flight route from the UP of Michigan to Chicago could easily take them through Mequon, but of course we wonder how they settled on that particular culvert. Perhaps as they drove, they were on the lookout for a very fast and efficient dumping ground where the child would be unlikely to be found. A culvert under the roadway in rural Mequon would do nicely. It's unclear whether they did the deed at night, operating under the cover of darkness. Again, it's possible the farmer was erroneous in seeing something suspicious, since the timing doesn't really add up. But if the Jutilas really did deposit Chester in the culvert in December 1958, then he remained unfound for nearly a year, which did not really mesh with the early estimates of how long the child had been dead. I was told by Special Agent McGrath that the lack of complete decomposition of Chester's body was credited to the moist environment in the culvert where he lay for what is now believed to be close to a year. Speaking of unanswered questions, remember the child Nancy Ritchie who disappeared from Wisconsin with her mother, and her father thought that the child found in the ditch in Mequon might be his daughter. Well, I don't want to invade Nancy's privacy, but all indications are that she and her mother left voluntarily, and Nancy is alive and well and living in Hawaii. Her father, Gordon's obituary states, "Gordy is survived by his daughter, Nancy, and all 3 grandchildren, Gary, Janice, and Kevin." Thank you so much to Wisconsin Department of Justice Special Agent Neil McGrath for emailing, speaking, and texting with me about this case. His agency is currently working to identify several does, so we hope to hear good news from them in the near future. Recently, I let listeners know about a new benefit available to them called an AbJack Insider subscription that's available through Apple Podcasts. An AbJack Insider subscription will give listeners ad-free access to every bit of DNA ID content published, both past episodes and future episodes. It will also give you benefits like early access and bonus content. Head over to Apple Podcasts and click on the DNA ID show page or the AbJack Entertainment channel to start a free trial. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. If you'd like to listen to the show ad-free and help support the show in the process, please head over to patreon.com/DNAID. And if you're interested in some fun DNA ID merch, visit the store at customizedgirl.com/s/DNAID podcast. To contact the show, please email us at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at DNAID Podcast on Instagram, at DNAID Podcast on Twitter, or on Facebook at facebook.com/DNAID Podcast. Finally, if you want to visit our website, go to dnaidpodcast.com. You'll be able to get all the episodes of the show, leave comments on episodes that I can respond to, and you can even leave voicemails. You'll get all the latest news about the show and important updates. Find links to our social media, merch, and a lot more. It's really your one-stop shop for everything DNA ID. DNA ID is written, researched, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt. Check out our other collaborative podcasts, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime.